My reign as a Jeopardy champion lasted almost 35 minutes.
This was coming, like the waiting room of the vasectomist, and I know that's not what he's called. I know there's like a fancy word, but...
If you leave, I have nothing left to live for.
So Centennial High School is on the south side of Los Angeles in Compton, and it's on the far west side of Compton, which means that it's in blood territory, as opposed to either Compton High or Dominguez, which are both Crip schools. Now, the dropout rate at Centennial is about 70%, which I found totally shocking until I had worked there a few months, at which point I began to feel shocked that 30% of the kids had managed to graduate. I showed up at Centennial in 1996 as a first-year teacher of U.S. history, courtesy of Teach for America. Now, many of you know Teach for America. It's this program where they recruit very ambitious, very idealistic young people who, have a lot of answers and are ready to use those answers to change the world. And it's a super program because after 2 or 3 years teaching in these incredibly difficult school districts, these hotshots realize that they don't know shit and they are much easier to get along with for the rest of their lives. Teach for America, amazing program. So there I was in Compton, 22 years old, full of answers, ready to teach U.S. history and meeting my very first student, Sheldon Lewis, who introduced himself to me as Allen Iverson, first-round draft pick of the Philadelphia 76ers, which I totally fell for, by the way. I was like, Allen, nice to meet you. I'm Ms. Ford. Welcome to U.S. history. And it pretty much went downhill from there. Like, it's obvious to Sheldon, you could say it's a self-evident truth, that he needs to know the dividing line between the Crips and the Bloods. But it's much less evident that he needs to know the dividing line between the Federalists and the Whigs and the early Republic. I didn't have anything to teach that Sheldon needed to know. He was very smart. He was very undereducated. And I just had nothing for him. Now, it wasn't so much that he was malicious. He could be. Like about 6 weeks in, I got sick. I missed a day of school. The district sent a sub who apparently was very disagreeable. And Sheldon faked a grand mal seizure so convincing that the sub went home. So he could be mean. But he wasn't mean to me. He just kind of disregarded me, except as a source of hilarious white ridiculousness. Like, I would try so hard to be relevant, I would refer to rap icon Tupac Shakur in the lectures. Except I made this little tiny air. I called him Tupac Shakur. And so then the rest of the year, when I would say, does anybody have a question? Anyone in the class have a question? Sheldon would say, Ms. Ford, I have a question. You hear from Tupac lately? I loved Sheldon, but he was very disruptive. And finally, despite the fact that I already had all the answers, I went to speak to Mr. Madrinich, who is the veteran teacher, science teacher next door to me. He had been there 100 years. And I confided in him that I couldn't, I had not been able to break through to Sheldon. And he listened, he understood. He had had Sheldon in class, and he had a solution for me. He said, Ms. Ford, take Sheldon to the side, talk to him one-on-one, tell him that he can still earn a C in U.S. history if he never comes back. He can earn a C in U.S. history if he never comes back. Mr. Madrinich had used that. Sheldon got a C in chemistry, right? This is Sheldon's path through high school. This is his path through U.S. history. is to get a C, because he's never going to come back, right? And that's where we were. That's where we were sort of stopped until we were both saved by the most unlikely historical personage, Andrew Jackson. Yes, like that Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States. Because before he was the 7th president of the United States, Andrew Jackson grew up in a poor farming family. His father died before he was born. It was a very violent time in this country's history. It was the Revolutionary War. Both of Andy's older brothers were fighting in the war. Both would later die. They never came home. He was like 11 years old, and he was a courier for the local militia. And the small home that he and his mother lived in was used by British soldiers. I mean, they were living there. They used what they wanted. They took what they wanted. And one night, a British major put his boots up on Mrs. Jackson's kitchen table. Little Andy's like crouched in a corner. And he says, "Boy, shine my boots." And this child leaps up out of the corner and he says, "Sir, go to hell." And the major drew his sword. He slashed at the boy, and Andy threw his hand up in time to save his eye. But he bore a scar the rest of his life, down his forehead, down the hand, and down his chin. Well, my students got Andrew Jackson. They got the hardscrabble upbringing. They got the loss. They got that fighting spirit. And they got, in a way that I never had before, what it feels like to be occupied by a hostile military presence, which is what they considered the LAPD to be. Now, Sheldon told me that, the LAPD would judge you solely based on your race, solely based on where you lived. And I believe that to be hyperbolic until the day that I got pulled over in Compton. I was on my way home from Centennial. It was probably 5 o'clock in the evening. I could not have been driving more than like 5 blocks, and the cruiser lights go on behind me. So, I pull right over. I'm not sure what I did, but I'm thinking, well, they do pull over white people too. This kind of proves that at least. Maybe it's my tags. 2 white officers in the car. One stays there, one comes up to my window, and the officer says, "Are you okay, ma'am? We're just checking to make sure everything is all right. This is not a very safe area. If you need any help getting to the freeway, we would be happy to escort you." It kind of reminded me of the time that they asked for chaperones for the home football games, for teachers to volunteer, and I volunteered. And Mr. Cunningham, the assistant principal, said, "Ms. Ford, I need teachers who are going to provide security, not require security." But as my run-in with the police demonstrated, I was the safest person at Centennial. I was totally safe, which is much more than I can say for my students. What I didn't really get about this 70% dropout rate is that it encompassed a lot more than dropping out. It encompassed like dropping dead or any other horrible thing that might happen to you that would prevent you from finishing your high school career. So at the beginning of the year, my second period U.S. history class of juniors, this like 16-year-old kids, had 45 students in it. Less than a week later, it had 44, because this boy whose name I didn't even ever learn was beaten so badly on his way home from school that he never came back. Well, like 2 weeks later, it went down to 43, because a student named Robert, I'm sure intending to avoid the same fate as nameless first student, brought a gun in his backpack to school. I had him in second period history. In third period chemistry, the gun went off. It shattered his femur, and he never came back to school. A week later, we went down to 43 because Adino Alonso, who was the only student I had who had the motivation and the diligence to actually try and succeed to memorize the 50 states, was deported to Mexico. They were just like dropping one by one, and there was nothing that Andrew Jackson or I could do to prevent that. And then came the night that Sheldon and his friend Jose were stopped by the police. They were driving in Compton. It was very late at night. The car had no taillights. They were stopped by 2 white police officers. I do not know if it was the same officers. And both officers got out of the car, and they told Jose to put his hands on the dashboard. And they asked Sheldon for his license, which he did not have on him because he did not have a driver's license. And they asked him for the registration of the car, which he did not have on him because the car was not registered. And then they asked both boys to get out of the car and put their hands on the roof. And then the officers were shining their flashlights, and they were looking all around the car. And then one of the officers says, "What in the hell is that?" And Sheldon said, "That's Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States." And it was because they had cut a picture of Andrew Jackson out of the textbook, which is not allowed. And they had taped that picture of Andrew Jackson into the rear window of their car, like a mascot, like a talisman. And Sheldon told the officers that Andrew Jackson grew up during the Revolutionary War. And he grew up very poor, and he was orphaned. His mother died before the end of it of cholera, treating the sick American soldiers. But he became the president of the United States. And the one officer looked at the other officer and he said, "Well, now I've seen it all." And they said, "Boys, you get in this car and you go straight home." And they did. I taught in LA for 3 years. I did not change the world. And I came home with no answers. But I believe that I might have changed that moment, just that one little moment. And it's the best thing I've ever done. Thank you.
Sarah Ford.